Our scripture reading this morning comes from the book of Joshua, chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. I'd invite you to follow along in the text as it's printed in our bulletins. And will you join me in welcoming Dominique O'Connell, who is going to be reading this morning's scripture.
Joshua 4, 1 through 9. When the entire nation had finished crossing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Select 12 men from the people, one from each tribe, and command them. Take 12 stones, stones from here out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet stood. Carry them over with you and lay them down in the place where you camp tonight." Then Joshua summoned the 12 men from the Israelites, whom he had appointed, one from each tribe. Joshua said to them, "Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder, one for each of the tribes of the Israelites, so that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, 'What do those stones mean to you?' then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off in front of the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Lord were cut off, so these stones shall be to the Israelites a memorial forever." The Israelites did as Joshua commanded. They took up 12 stones out of the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord told Joshua. Carried them over with them to the place where they camped, and laid them down there. Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priest bearing the ark of the covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. Thank you.
Some weeks ago, I found myself scrambling to find a parking space at Naples Community Hospital North Campus. I was going to visit a few parishioners in the hospital. I was in a bit of a time crunch as there was some family meeting me in one of the hospital rooms, and I began to spin my way around the parking lot until finally a space became available. But it wasn't just any space. It just so happened to be the exact same space where I parked our minivan back in 2019 when one of my daughters was born. We had been in the hospital for a couple of nights, and I recall being in that parking space, attaching the new car seat in the minivan. And as I sat in that space again for the first time in 4 years, the memories, of course, came rushing back. And as I began to think about the visits I was about to make, I was reassured that no matter what it was that I faced in that hospital room, I could get through it all, because I remembered that God was present for me 4 years prior. The power of memory. So often as we walk into the unknown future, one of the best reassurances we have is the gift of memory, or memorialized space, that God affords to each one of us. For we walk back into our scripture today, a scripture most appropriate for Memorial Day weekend, and part of what we learn is there's some spiritual wisdom when it comes to sacred space in our lives. It's the story of Joshua and the Israelites crossing the Jordan River. You'll recall the story. Once upon a time, Joshua, a new leader, faced the daunting task of moving God's people across the Jordan River and into battle against the fortified cities of Canaan, into the promised land. God intervenes by drying up the riverbed, and God's people are able to cross this river that they experience some anxiety about. But before they just run off into the promised land, God instructed Joshua and Joshua's people to go into the middle of the riverbed and to collect together 12 stones representing the tribes of Israel, and to clump those stones together into a memorial to mark the spot, if you will, of God's miraculous intervention. God, through Joshua, shares back with God's people generations from now, when children ask what happened here, be sure to tell the story of God's deliverance in this space. And I do wonder, in asking the larger question, why? Why would God have asked God's people to clump together 12 memorial stones to mark the spot of God's intervention? The God I know wouldn't have done this to meet God's unmet ego needs. It wasn't about God in this moment. My sense is that God wanted God's people to have a memorial, a spot where they could go and remember God as they faced the unknown future. And there are many times where this occurs in the Hebrew Bible. You'll recall that Jacob, when God gave Jacob a dream, Jacob built some pillars to mark that spot where God renewed God's covenant with Jacob. Moses and the 10 Commandments, another great example. God gifts Moses the 10 Commandments, and Moses builds a memorial there on Mount Sinai to mark the spot. Humor me for a moment. If you were one of the Israelites and you were going off into the promised land, if an enemy were to come your way, or if you were experiencing grief, or if you were experiencing heartache or fear of the unknown future, where would you go to pray? Where would you go for strength or assurance? I would park myself in that space in front of the memorial to remember where God had been at work in the past. For often when we go off into the unknown future, one of the deepest fears we all have in our humanity is that God is not going to show up in that unknown. And one of the best gifts or blessings that we have in the face of an unknown fear or an unknown future is our memory of God intervening in the past. I mean, consider for a moment this morning what you might be anxious about as it relates to your unknown future. If it's a health issue, maybe remembering a time when God delivered you or a loved one through another health issue may be in part your strength as you face the future unafraid. Or if it's a concern you have about a child or a grandchild, perhaps remembering a time when God got you through another bit of adversity related to a child or a grandchild might be part of the key to facing that challenge. Or if you have to experience something new, maybe going back mentally in your mind and thinking about another time you faced something new and God showed up for you, maybe that's part of the reassurance that you need. Or if you have concerns about the future of America, the future of this country, maybe going back into history and thinking through about a time in the past where God got this country through, maybe that's part and parcel of what you need to have the strength to face the future unafraid. I'm not surprised that one of the great Catholic theologians, St. Augustine, wrote considerably about the topic of memory. In his book, The Confessions, Augustine put it this way: our memory is a great and boundless chamber. What a shame it would be for any Christian not to use that memory as a bit of strength in facing the unknown future. You know, a few weeks ago, I was by the memorial garden at the church, accessing the south parking lot adjacent to Gates Chapel. And there was a couple that was trying to get into the chapel, but the doors were locked. And so I greeted them, and they kind of backed off the doors, and they said, "Whew, we're so glad you're not the minister." And I introduced myself as the minister, and they laughed. And they shared back with me that approximately 30 years ago, in this space, in this sanctuary space, they had been married, and they were back in Naples for vacation, and they were wondering if they could return to the spot. And you know, our humor and laughs kind of broke down the barrier a little bit. And the gentleman was sharing back with me that they had just received a really, really hard diagnosis. And they said going back into this space would be meaningful to them. And then they inspired my sermon title today. They said, it's kind of a back to the future moment for us. Therein lies the power of sacred space, of remembering, of going back into the future. I'll close this morning with a final story. It's a story about our nation, and a story that I think really speaks to what's happening here in Joshua chapter 4. God asking God's people to remember God in and through sacred space. It's a story about Memorial Day weekend of 2020. There were a group of churchgoers across denominational lines who, during the most dangerous moments of the pandemic, decided to gather outdoors at 6 feet in mass at an unusual site. They decided to gather in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, at the memorial field where United Flight 93 went down on September 11th of 2001. Distanced 6 feet, they shared their prayer in that moment, and there was some news media that was present, and they decided to pull aside one of the women who was praying for our nation during the height of the pandemic. And they said, "Isn't that unusual? Didn't you get your tragedies mixed up? I mean, this is a memorial that commemorates a space that was sacred to our nation back in 2001. Why did you choose to pray here?" And she said that the location was not arbitrary. Her comment was, if God got our country through that almost 20 years ago, surely God will show up for us now. As individuals and as a nation, one of the greatest bits of peace and strength we have in the future is to remember God being present for us in the past. May we remember those memorialized moments, and may we face our future unafraid.